the early 70s, OPEC didn't like what we were doing in Israel. Same old story. And so they cut off our oil supplies. So some of you will remember these long lines at the gas stations. And we feared we were going to have another depression like the 1929 depression. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, we can't allow OPEC to blackmail us anymore. You guys got to come up with a plan so this will never happen again. We knew that that plan had to involve Saudi Arabia because it had more oil than anybody else, and it also, the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. The long version is explained in the book, but the short version of what we did, the deal we finally struck with the House of Saud, was a deal whereby they would return almost all the money they made from selling oil to the United States, invested in U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department would use the interest from those securities, which over the years has amounted to trillions of dollars, to hire U.S. companies to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical complexes, desalinization plants, whole cities out of the desert, McDonald's and all the other things that go along with our Western culture. The House of Saud would also agree to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to the oil companies, possibly not acceptable to you and me, but acceptable to the oil companies. And this is very, very important. They agreed that they would never, ever sell oil for anything other than U.S. dollars. This happened in the early 70s, right after we'd gone off the gold standard because we were bankrupt, because we could not pay off our debts to European countries in gold. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And then we were stuck with a situation of why will anybody in the world use dollars? So very shortly we came up with this plan, which in essence put the dollar on the oil standard. You cannot buy oil on the world market for anything other than dollars, and that's very important to the corporatocracy. Our part of the bargain was we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, in control. It was an amazing deal, the deal of the century. It was history-making. The corporatocracy looked at this as an incredible success. I had done my job. We economic hitmen did a great job with that one. So we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something very similar. Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said, Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. How novel is that? But we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. He failed. And so the CIA went directly, and this is all history, I'm not creating this. CIA went in and had Qasim publicly executed on Iraqi television. They put Saddam's cousin in charge. He became president of Iraq, and Saddam became vice president in charge of security. Eventually, as you know, he became president. He was our boy. He was our man. And in the 1980s, we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something similar to Saudi Arabia. It was such a successful deal, because after all, what we want to do is control the Middle East and control the oil in the Middle East. For those of you who think that Israel is about creating a homeland for the Jewish people, you're as deceived as most of them are. It's partly about that, perhaps, but what it's really about is creating a surrogate fortress in the middle of the Middle East. The Israelis are being used as pawns. They're being used like old armies used to use sheep that ran before the armies. They're our surrogates. And their leadership knows that. Most Israelis probably don't. They think they're creating a homeland. But it's a very, very sad situation of what's going on there. And of course, the Lebanese and the Palestinians are caught in the middle of this. And Iraq is part of that too. We have to remember that Middle Eastern oil is the oil that's used by a great deal of Europe, China, and Japan. If we control Middle Eastern oil, we control our biggest potential competitors, Japan, China, Europe. So in the 80s, we decided that Saddam ought to accept the same sort of deal that the Saudis had accepted. The economic hitmen went in and did their job on him, but he wouldn't buy. He'd been our man, but he wouldn't buy. If he had, he'd still be president of Iraq, and we'd be selling him all the tanks and fighter jets and all the chemical plants he wants. But he wouldn't buy. So we sent in the jackals. They couldn't take him out. His security was very good, and he had many doubles, many lookalikes. Saddam had been our man. He had been our assassin. He knew our ways. So we couldn't take him out. So in 91 we sent in the military, our military, and some of you people were there. We could have taken Saddam out at that time, and I think you who were there probably know that better than anybody else. But we didn't want to. Saddam was the type of man the corporatocracy likes. The strong man, could keep his people under control. He could keep the Iranians under control on their borders pretty well. He could keep the Kurds under control. We thought that when we took out his military, he would be sufficiently chastised that now he would buy our deal. So the economic hitmen went back to work on him in the 90s. Couldn't bring him around again, though. Again, if they had, he'd still be there. The assassins couldn't take him out again. So once again, the military went in. And they're still there. Of course, if we'd struck that deal with him, we would be building, our Bechtels and Halliburtons would be building huge cities there and petrochemical complexes, just like they've done in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that's what they're doing there now, too, in a different way. But that's what this is all about. That's what these wars